Hi, I'm Dr. Matthew Sharps. Welcome back to the world of the mind. When we think about the mind and the brain, we're immediately forced to realize that they operate in natural systems. All right? We are part of the biological world. Humans are a part of the biological world. We are a kind of animal. But what kind of animal? The fact is, we're very different from anything else that's ever lived on this planet. Okay? And there's been all kinds of attempts to figure out, okay, what exactly differentiates the human from the rest of the animate world. Okay? And some of these are somewhat facetious. We can say, well, we can put the chimps in the cage and they can't put us in, so we've got that going for us. But others are a little more serious. For example, one idea that was bandied about for years is that humans are the tool users. We're the creatures that use tools. Well, zoological observations have shown that all kinds of creatures use tools. All sorts of monkeys and things bash nuts with rocks to eat them, and all sorts of birds poke twigs into various crevices to get their food. Chimpanzees are amazing tool users. They have these wonderful sticks they'll stick down on a termite mound, bring it back up covered with termites. They eat all the termites, have a wonderful time. Now, so this is tool use, but the fact of the matter is you can say that at a sort of philosophical level. Okay, now see, humans are just like the other animals because they're using tools. Well, quite frankly, the day a chimpanzee shows up with a nice chrome-plated socket set from Sears, okay, then it's going to be time to talk. Okay, because it's realistically there's quite a bit of difference between poking a stick at some termites and changing spark plugs, but you really can't use tools as the delimiter because you can argue that okay, there's a continuum here, and whether you want to argue that I don't know. But one thing that differentiates humans from everything else in the universe that we know of anyway is language. Humans are the only thing that under natural circumstances makes use of language. Now, if you've grown up with, various Disney movies where the animals are all speaking English with a Midwest accent and occasionally talking to magic flying teapots or whatever it is, you may not think that's correct. But the fact of the matter is that language is different from any other communication system. And only humans naturally have it. We can teach elements of it to various apes and even to dolphins, even to sea lions. And that's been done. We'll be talking about that in a future video. But ultimately, language is very different from other communication systems. And that leads us to a problem, really. Because if you're living with other creatures, you obviously have to communicate. And sometimes, if you're living with other creatures, well, it looks like maybe you need to communicate, and it turns out that maybe you don't. Now, here's a picture of a kudu, a South African antelope. They're not the brightest creatures on the planet. And you notice the kudu is currently being ridden by a little bird. The bird is called an oxpecker, and they land on all sorts of animals, and they peck the bugs off the animals, and that's nice for the animals because it gets them cleaned up. It's a grooming thing. Well, the point is these two animals are living together, and you might think, well, how are they communicating? It's like the various Disney characters. How are they doing this? Well, as far as we know, they're not. Okay? Now, the fact of the matter is the oxpecker is basically treating the kudu as a kind of four-legged Winnebago, okay? It's riding around on a walking and running motorhome, okay? And it's eating the bugs, and I guess that's nice for the kudu. And I've never seen this, but I would imagine every so often the bird gets too close to the animal's face and ticks it off. Maybe the kudu takes a snap at it, I have no idea. But the bird would presumably squawk, fly away, come back and eat another bug, possibly out of tooth range, okay? The point is these creatures are living in what you might call a little community of two. They don't necessarily have to communicate with each other. And you see lots of things like this in the natural world, that maybe we're not really seeing communication. Maybe we're simply seeing a way of living together. There's a whole variety of different ways of doing that within the biological realm. But there are times you do have to communicate with others of your species, and you think, well, fair enough, so maybe it's all kind of like language, but language comes out of the brain, doesn't it? Many people listening to this will know that the human speech center, it's on the left in 85% of humans, it's the Broca's area here, in typically the left frontal cortex, and it's this area of speech production, and below that is an area called Wernicke's area, which is a major area of speech reception. We'll be talking more about those as we go as well in these videos. But, so the point being, well, you've got to have this brain to do this communication, don't you? But can you communicate without any brain at all? And the answer is yes, and we see it in some genuinely murderous trees. Now, a scientist named Van Hoven, a zoologist, was investigating the death of some hundreds of kudu in South Africa, in Africa some years ago, and came on something very interesting, okay? Why had all these antelope died? Because they'd been eating the leaves of acacia trees that produced poisons, tannin-based poisons, which were killing off the antelope. Well, that makes a certain amount of sense. You don't want to be eating poisonous plants, and apparently kudu are none too bright about that, so you just keep eating and away they go. But what's interesting about that is, when a given tree is being stressed by the antelope eating leaves, it produces more of these poisons. You say, well, that makes a certain amount of sense. If a tree's getting stressed, it's going to put out various hormones that's going to do this, okay? And fair enough. But it turns out the trees were communicating. Because one of the hormones, the phytohormones, the plant hormones that's produced, is ethylene. Now, ethylene is a very mysterious substance. It even has psychotropic properties in human beings, okay? But ethylene has a variety of functions in plants, but these trees, these acacia, when they were being stressed by the antelope eating their leaves, would put off a burst of ethylene that would go downwind. And other acacia would receive this burst of ethylene, and they started making more poison too. And Van Hoven's concept here is that these antelope are now eating all these trees, which have basically gotten a kind of DEFCON alert here, okay? The one tree is being stressed by being eaten by an antelope. It's not saying to itself, but it's as if it's saying, holy cow, holy kudu, I guess, I'm being eaten by this damn kudu. I'm going to alert all the neighbors. Now, it doesn't actually have to say that, does it? All it has to do is produce the chemical, which when received by the proper receptors in the other trees, will produce that chemical in them. And before long, you've got a whole lot of dead kudu, lying there with little plus signs for eyes. Okay, it's a very, very strange, kind of tragic thing if you're a kudu, to say the least. But the point is, these trees are communicating. Now, the trees and the kudu are kind of forming a community, aren't they? In this case, it's basically murderer and victim, so to speak, although you can, well, I suppose you could say self-defense because they need to keep their leaves. But another kind of creature also eats these leaves, and that's the giraffe here. If you see these pictures of giraffes I took in South Africa, you notice, first of all, they're quite pretty animals, okay? And subjectively, they seem to know it. They're sort of swashing around through the savannah, the great savannah forest there. It's kind of like watching an 18-foot tall beauty contest, okay? And occasionally they're very vicious to each other. They kick, they bite, they slam each other with their necks. So they're not very nice. So in a way, it's very much like an 18-foot beauty contest if you think about it. But when you look at a giraffe, and look at them, there's no way you're going to think, hey, that animal is a thinker. Okay, it doesn't really look like the sort of creature that depends a hell of a lot on its little brain up there, and way up there in the air. Well, it turns out they are, because Van Hoven and other observations showed that when giraffe prey on these acacia trees, they prey on the ones that are upwind. Somehow, and God knows how, giraffes have figured out, at least some giraffes have figured out, that you don't go downwind and eat those acacia leaves because those trees have gotten the word. They've gotten the signal. They're basically producing all this wonderful poison for the antelope dropping dead like crazy. The giraffes are going upwind where those trees haven't heard about it, and manja, they're eating the leaves, having a wonderful time, and they don't apparently get killed as like the kudu do, and if you knew kudu like I knew kudu, you'd never do kudu again, I suppose. Bad shrink, no donut. But the point is, you've got this very complex community, and there's communication happening here. And somehow, these giraffes have learned from other giraffes to go upwind. Now, we don't really know how that's the case. Our best bet is that they're imitating. Possibly the young giraffes imitate the mommy giraffe. I doubt very sincerely they're going, I say, old chap, get upwind of these things. They're not doing anything in a linguistic sense. They may simply be imitating the other creatures moving about, and we see that quite frequently in the natural world. But the point really is this. We're seeing communication here between tree and tree with no brain whatsoever. And we're seeing something like a kudu, who apparently is just not one of your top intellectual animals, continue to eat the poisonous leaves until down it goes. And the giraffes, somehow or other, do you want to call it developing a culture? I don't think any scholars listening to this would want to go that far. But developing, if you will, indulge me for a moment, a culture of eating the damn things upwind. Now, this kind of communication can be incredibly complex. Now, consider insects. Insects are so simple that generally the bottom third of their brain does nothing but control their jaws. They're very, very simple creatures. And yet, when you look at the leafcutter ants of the Americas, they're doing something very spectacular. There's a variety of different kinds of this type of ant. Some of them actually are literally ranching aphids producing this substance that they eat. But the ones I want to talk about here live with a very, very large fungus under the ground, okay? And when I was in school, about the time the last dinosaurs were still sick, okay, well, we knew about leafcutter ants, and we saw these wonderful films of leafcutter ants, these little ants, each carrying a leaf along the logs, carrying them back, and they dump them on the fungus, and the fungus would then grow, and everybody was happy. So the idea was the ants are farming the fungus, okay? So in other words, they're putting the leaf bits, the bits they cut, that's why they're leafcutter ants, right? The bits they cut, they put on the fungus, and the fungus grows, and the ants eat these little mushroom-like growths that come off the fungus, and everybody's happy. So these leaves are doing the same sort of thing that fertilizers do for farmers and fertilizers and compost do for gardeners. Isn't that remarkable? These animals, really with no brain, are capable of doing this farming. The problem is we now know there's a lot more to it than that. Because the fact of the matter is, this fungus, like pretty much any living creature, has more than one kind of need. You can't just keep dumping the same kind of leaf on it and have it expect to grow. The fungus needs different amounts and different kinds of leaves at different places on its enormous fungal body. And it is chemically communicating to the ants. Not only go out and get me this kind of leaf, but drop it in the right place on my enormous fungal body. Okay? Now, meanwhile, okay, the natural world is never behaving like these movies with the magical talking animals talking to the flying teapots. It doesn't work that way. It's more like a kind of terrifying crime scene crossed with a really bad restaurant, okay? Because, of course, the trees that the ants are leaf cutting their leaves out of don't care to lose those damn leaves, so they start producing a variety of poisons, too. And the ants are now, mindlessly, if you will, carrying the poisonous leaves back to the fungus, which is now being poisoned by its own feeding troops, these ants, because the enemy tree is out here. Well, you think, now it will poison, there will be no more fungus among us. Bad shrink. But you get the idea. No, you don't have to have any thought going here. And it usually doesn't work. Because when the fungus starts getting too much of the poison, it signals the ants to go out and attack a different tree. This amazing complexity is going on by a living creature, a living organism, this enormous basic, botanists will kill me for this, but basically this gigantic bloody great mushroom down there. It's okay, that was too bad even for me. This gigantic fungal growth under the ground, communicating with its little armies of ants here, going out and getting the right leaves, bringing them in. Oh hell, that's too much of the poisonous leaves, go get me another kind of leaf. It's a remarkable thing, and nowhere in it do we see mind. There's nothing here really. There's an interest here to the behavioral scientists because we're looking at behavioral. Behavioral, that's good. Behavior. But for the student of mind, there's really nothing here. And yet there is communication. So it turns out that there's a hell of a lot more going on out in the natural world than bits of brain saying talk or listen and get this and this right, you know. And Broca's area, by the way, is very, very close to the neural control systems that control the mouth and the lips and the tongue, which is one reason we can talk so well. And that, in turn, is pretty close to the control systems for the hands, which I'm getting a little too far out here, but may be a good part of the reason why human beings, especially those suffering from hearing impairments, are capable of learning sign language with the hands, okay? Wernicke's area, very, very close to the human auditory cortex. So we seem to be, our brains are predisposed to this amazing language business here. Well, fair enough. But what makes language so different? What makes it so special? Well, the linguists have given us all sorts of wonderful distinctions here, okay? All languages have, for example, phonemes and morphemes, the smallest units of sound and the smallest units of meaning, okay? So in English, can be a phoneme, right? You can't really get anything smaller than and it can also be a morpheme, as in a tree or a kudu, right? It's the indefinite article. So you've got that going for you. You say, well, okay, fair enough, that's language, but damn it all, lots of animals put out some kind of click or squeak or snarl or something, and it means something. So we're not that far, are we? Languages also all have syntax, which is the formal structure of the strings of symbols used in a language, and all languages have some form of grammar that basically prescribes the syntax. Now, that said, well, okay, the grammars differ all over the place. In German, you can put the verb at the end, etc., etc. So the different languages are very different, these things. Tonals in languages change a lot of things for those of us living in non-tonal, essentially non-tonal languages like English. All these various factors of grammar and syntax. Say, well, that's what distinguishes language, but the problem is it doesn't. Because ant communication, again, ants are coming up a lot today. It turns out that in some ants, the commands they get from the rest of the ants to do this or that depend on the order in which various complex smells are produced. Well, in a way, you can say, well, fair enough, that's syntactic. Now, all languages also have semantics. There's a wonderful amount of connotation and denotative semantics. It's wonderful. But all languages have semantics, which is to say meaning. So, fair enough. We search for meaning, okay? Well, the problem is, if you've ever been charged by a buffalo or anything else, there's obviously some meaning going there. The meaning may be, I'm going to stamp you like a greasy spot. The meaning might conceivably be, if you go far enough, you're going to need a new fender on your car if the buffalo actually hits the car. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of meaning out there in the natural world. So what really does distinguish language from anything else? Well, the linguists usually talk about two major dimensions of language. One is openness and productivity, and the other is displacement. Now, what are these things? Well, openness is the fact that you can use language. Basically, it's open. You can use the linguistic combinations, words and phrases, to express any idea in the universe. Now, unfortunately, philosophically, how do you prove that? And how do you prove that you couldn't do the same thing with a variety of other calls? Okay, so that's a bit of a Picayune distinction. Certainly, language is a big damn thing, and you can express all sorts of things in it. Before there was such a thing as a cell phone or a disk drive, nobody used the words, and now they do. Okay. Now, this is closely linked, though, with productivity. I think that's a bit more testable, more interesting, because productivity, basically, it comes down to the idea that we can express novel concepts. We can come up with new concepts. We can come up with an idea of a disk drive or a cell phone or whatever the next new thing's going to be, and we can actually understand it and deal with it. So language is productive. Okay, so language is open and productive in a way that, nothing else really seems to be, okay? We're going to talk in our next video about vervet monkeys with whom I developed quite a relationship years ago when I was doing my master's thesis. And the fact of the matter is, vervets have these various chirps and cheeps that tell each other what kind of predator's coming. And, well, the fact is, they never come up with anything new, okay? One of the places I was working with these animals, helicopters were coming over routinely, and the monkeys would all freak out, okay? But none of them are going, hey, UH-1 gunship conversion. They couldn't do that. They're basically just shouting the alarm call for eagle, eagle, eagle. Now, they were shouting it quite loudly, so you could at least say, well, maybe they're shouting big eagle, big eagle. But there was nothing like, hey, Huey Cobra, oh, that's a new model. They can't do that, okay? And the other thing they can't do, beyond that call systems, as we'll see in our next video, the most complex kind of communication that isn't language, okay? The other thing that language can do that nothing else seems to be able to do is displacement. And that's the ability to talk about things that are not present in space or time. Okay? So if I can say something like next year in Jerusalem or last year in Marienbad, I'm actually using displacement. I'm talking about a place that isn't here in Central California, and I'm talking about a time that isn't here either, next year, last year, 15 minutes ago. Language allows you to displace with its various tenses and so forth. It's lovely. So we can make plans and we can learn from our mistakes. We do learn from our mistakes, so as far as I can tell, we keep repeating them exactly. But with this displacement, well, that seems to be unique to language, and that's our story, and we're sticking to it. And the problem is even those don't work, do they? Why not? Well, consider productivity, okay? The humpback whales, some of them go travel from Alaska down to the Lahaina Road south of Maui every year, and they come down there, and they do the songs of the whales, things that you can record, and some people find them soothing, others find them very irritating as the whales go, that sort of thing as the whales are yapping away. Well, it turns out that practically every year when the whales turn back up at Maui, they've got some new so-called songs. They're making new squeaks and grunts and gurks, okay? Now, God knows what a lot of them mean. There are all sorts of wonderful suppositions about it, but a lot of them have to do with with actual communication, right, with dealing with each other. But the point is, they change practically every year. Now, lots of people think, okay, well, whales, they got big damn brains. Maybe they're doing something we really don't understand. Well, I will leave that one up to you. But these little anole lizards you also find all over Hawaii. They're not indigenous, but they turned up late one Tuesday, and now they're all over the place. Well, these little anoles also seem to do the same thing. Now, these lizards, these anoles, okay, not technically, what they do is they have a little dewlap that they open and close down here, and these animals can see into the ultraviolet. So whereas to us it's just a little white lump coming up and down, for them it's all these amazing purple and yellow stripes and things that go into areas of color that really human beings can't see. Well, the point about these damned anoles is their little patterns change. They seem to come up with new ones. And that seems to be that they're doing productivity. And as far as displacement goes, well, those damn whales migrate from Alaska to Hawaii. Now, they're not saying to each other, hey, let's go to Maui, okay? Anywhere in the geese flying overhead are probably saying, hey, we're going to land in the Sawhill Ponds near Boulder, Colorado. They may not be doing that. But they are clearly expressing an idea to each other about we all going to go someplace else, okay? Migratory creatures, in a way, are doing displacement. I can hear choruses of linguists screaming in very bad language because, well, it's not the same thing. They're not saying, hey, there's this great bar in Maui, let's go get wasted. They're not doing that, okay? But they clearly have a destination, and they get there through a variety of fascinating ways. Sometimes the angle of the sun, all sorts of amazing ways animals have to navigate, which we will be discussing in a later video in this series. But at the end of the day, it's very difficult to suggest that an animal is migrating if it doesn't have some idea of where the hell it's going. And since they do it in a group, it's pretty bloody obvious that somehow or other they're communicating this, and it really isn't language, is it? So what sort of chance does that give us? It turns out that, well, I'm doing a bit of devil's advocate here, but you can't really talk about openness, because how do you prove the ability to express the infinite? It's very difficult. Productivity, well, it turns out that these damned animals are changing their squeaks and grunts if they're whales, or they'll dewlap if they're anoles. What's really going on? Well, I think that really the only way you can discuss it is not with reference to a particular delineative definition. This has openness, this does not. This has productivity, this does not. I think you have to look at it in aggregate. Just as animals do use tools, but they're not likely to turn up with a lovely socket set, all right? It's not the same thing. In aggregate, there's a great difference. Let me use a quick example. Years ago, this was so many years ago that we didn't have digital. One of the things I love about the modern computer world is digital photography. It makes life so much easier. You don't have to have the special balanced film and the low light film and the UV filter. Oh, well, UV filters, yes, but you have all this amazing lens stuff you used to have to photograph under natural conditions. It was a mess. I remember once I was photographing using what's called a macro lens to magnifying a bit with this wonderful gigantic UV filter on it in the jungle on the island of Kauai. I was photographing these wonderful little anole lizards for my classes and for other things. And anyway, there he was on a leaf and doing this thing with his little, and I have my camera right up close to him. Here, I snuck up to him. It's an SLR, so I'm looking through it. I'm photographing this lizard. I've got my wonderful camera system, this high-tech tool that humans use, and I guarantee nothing else does. But anyway, he saw his reflection. Now, God knows what he was seeing, because remember, these are creatures that can see into light spectra that we can't, and I've got a UV filter on that. I have no idea what picture, what movie he was looking at out of his little eye, but suddenly, he found himself absolutely fascinating. That's what anoles do. He's looking at it like crazy. And then he starts pumping up and down, which is a lovely display of, I'm an anole, this is my territory, bugger off, you know? I was like, oh, this is fascinating. I don't think he knows it's himself. Well, the point is, I have no idea what he's doing with the UV because I couldn't see it. But he starts, the dewlap starts going in and out like crazy. He's doing these push-ups. And now the problem is, of course, the lizard, so to speak, the lizard in the mirror, with, I suppose, apologies to Michael Jackson, the lizard in the mirror, the anole in the mirror is doing the same damn things, okay? And it's doing it just as well and as fast as he is. And I believe he found himself both frightening, well, really three things, frightening, threatening, and startlingly attractive. And I don't even know how I got the pictures, because I suddenly do this. It's looking through the single lens reflex. He suddenly sexually assaulted the lens. He leaps off the leaf onto the lens, kabang, and then he goes flying off into the jungle, leaving, shall we say, a residue that took quite a few of these little cleaning cloths to get off my UV filter there. This is an animal that comes up with new signals on a regular basis. You can, if you want to, if you philosophically say, yes, that's productivity, isn't it? But I can guarantee you this, nobody listening to this talk, or watching this talk, is going to go out, see yourself in a full-length mirror, find yourself both threatening and startlingly attractive, start threatening yourself for a bit, and then sexually assaulting the mirror. You're not going to do it. And this is what I mean by, and we'll be talking about this in other videos as well, analysis in aggregate. You have to look at the whole picture. Yes, animals use tools, but no, the chimps are not going to turn up with an air hammer. Okay. Yes, there are creatures that are talking about migrating someplace or other, but they're not talking sentimentally about that night in Rio. They're not doing that. Okay. So what we've got here is a series of behaviors, communicative behaviors, that ultimately became language, and they obviously ultimately evolved from someplace. But I don't think we're going to get there by these rather hair-splitting definitional factors, because what we're looking at here is systems in aggregate. As we'll see later in other videos here, the great apes can be taught various forms of sign language, American Sign Language, because a lot of this work was done in America, to Coco, the gorilla, who's now died. Most of these animals are now dead. But the point is, they learn some level of language. And so, Coco could say, please tickle Coco, Coco, good gorilla. Others could say, give Washo fruit. They could point at a watermelon, go water fruit, water fruit. That was very exciting because it looked like it was productive, right? One of the animals that was trained to interact with what was basically a vending machine in a way, so she could go, her name was Lana, she'd go, please machine, give Lana apple, okay, because they could do that. Say, well, hooray, this is language, isn't it? Because they're communicating, it's got grammatical factors. There was a huge kerfuffle, by the way, when a psychologist named Terrace trained a chimp called Nim, and he never did quite pick up the whole nuances. People get very, very angry at both of them about this. Well, fair enough. We'll talk about this later, but here's my point. Yes, you can say, Coco, good gorilla, Coco want tickle, or please, et cetera, et cetera. All these things, and Coco even apparently we would even joke at a fairly primitive level. Call yourself a monkey if you didn't say, oh no, Coco, wonderful, beautiful gorilla, then she'd sulk. Apparently, that's something I've read. I did not see it, but suffice to say, no young gorilla has ever written his sexual desires on a bathroom wall. They just don't do it. You're not going to find a young gorilla, possibly on the internet, possibly on YouTube, leaving a message, young gorilla with the young silverback with good life goals and good promise, seek same for long walks in the jungle, enjoy mushing up your bananas. It doesn't happen. In aggregate, humans are different. And so if we want to understand where language came from, we've got to look at what creates these differences, not in the rather hair-splitting, almost platonic, really, either-or definition, but in terms of the overarching aggregate behaviors that comprise language. The problem is, where do we start? Because in previous videos in these series, we talked about the human precursors of modern humans, Australopithecines, Homo habilis, and there's really no evidence that any of those creatures had language, is there? And Homo erectus, assume the obvious jokes have been told, just means upright person, okay? Homo erectus, well, I believe they had some form of language. I'd love to know what it was, because it must have been relatively simple. It can't have been, I suppose it could have been a modern evolved language, because Homo erectus, their brain size of 1,000 cubic centimeters, about that of a modern human 5-year-old child. So maybe it was some kind of, it'd be lovely to understand. Lots of people say, no, they didn't have language. But the complexity of their behaviors, we've talked about this in other videos, indicate to me that they probably did. Okay. Neanderthal. When I was in college, again, about the time the last dinosaur was still sick, most scholars said, no, Neanderthal could not speak. They could not speak. Well, then somebody dug up the hyoid bone of a Neanderthal, the bone that really controls down here in the voice box. It's the same as a modern human. So basically, well, maybe today the idea seems to be, well, they could speak, but their voices were kind of screechy. I'm not quite sure how you got there, but it might even be true, too. But the point is this. Here we are, modern humans. Well, why don't we just look at language and all these other humans? Starting me with some kind of advanced calls in Australopithecine, maybe getting to some, tagging in Homo habilis to a more complex thing. Oh, let's us make raft for Homo erectus. You have Tarzan speak kind of thing. We can't, because they're all dead. Now, modern humans have come up with all kinds of reasons why every other kind of human on this planet is extinct. The Neanderthals, the Denisovans, half a dozen kind of things that we used to lump together under Homo erectus. They're all dead. And, maybe it was the climate change. Maybe they ran out of kudus, God knows. My personal suspicion, having worked in forensic cognitive psychology, having consulted on a number of crime situations, my personal supposition is simply that though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we fear no evil, for we are the meanest frickin' thing in the valley. Okay? But suffice to say, whatever killed everybody else, they're all gone. The only kind of human left is us, Homo sapiens sapiens. A wonderful name. It means the wise person. We're so wise we named us twice. Our Greek name is even better for us. I've mentioned this before. Anthropos, he who looks up, which is why we keep tripping over crap in the woods. But at the end of the day, here we are, Homo sapiens sapiens, the wise guy with his bombs, bazookas, and so forth. We're the only one left. So how do we get at the nature of language? How can we start to understand the nature of communication, really? Well, I think the best way to do it, and it's not terribly satisfactory, is to look at other living creatures' forms of communication. How do other animals, let's get away from the trees, because there's no evolutionary factor there we're going to be able to understand with trees poisoning the animals and telling each other to poison more animals. We're not going to get there. But how do the other animals communicate? That's what we're going to be talking about in part 2 of this particular video. And, well, hope you found this interesting and useful. Hope you subscribe if you feel like it. I'm Dr. Matthew Sharps. This is The World of the Mind.